didn't want to have to read the sermon. So on the first day of the week, at early dawn, the women came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found that the stone was rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you, while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all of this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen clothes by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Now on that same day, two of them were going on to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from remembering him and recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place." Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road, and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. So here's a pop quiz. He is risen. Hallelujah. All right, one more time. He is risen. Hallelujah.
This is risen.
Yay! All right, one person. One more time. He is risen. Hallelujah. Christ is risen indeed. Hallelujah. Now, you're probably wondering, why did he make us repeat that more than once? My family, I woke up this morning to a text from my mom and my dad and my brother, and now that we have this group text thing, we will say that to each other. It used to be we used to call each other at daybreak and say, and irritate each other on Easter by saying, "He is risen!" But it was always something we did in our family. And I grew up as a military brat, and so I wasn't really a preacher's kid until I went to college. But that is something that has stuck with me, is that on Easter Sunday, you say he is risen indeed. These are more than just words that we say in church once a year. In fact, they were spoken by the faithful even at the earliest times of the church. I mean, these are some of the first words that were spoken by the early church. And you know what? They're a statement of faith, even in the midst of doubt. How many of you are doubters? I'm going to raise both hands. I have doubted. I have doubted God's existence. Can anybody else raise your hand with me on that? Please? Because I don't want to feel alone, for one. You could think that I had been to seminary that I wouldn't have any doubt, but I do. But you know what? This is a statement of faith that he is risen. And they're a statement of our hopes also. Even in the face of the reality of our fears, because we all fear in this life, though. We fear death. We fear what happens next. We fear not being liked well enough. But you know, when we say he is risen, it means that there's something greater than us, and that's why we are called to church. They're also a rallying cry for life, even though we know that there is an inevitability about death, right? Because we know that we're going to die one day. Now, most of us don't want to admit that until we're about 80 or 90 years old, right? And maybe we recognize it every once in a while at a funeral, but then we get surprised by friends dying early, or cancer, or other things happening. So today we gather on the holiest of Christian holidays, even more holy than Christmas. And according to Scripture, this is the day that some Christians realized what had happened. Now, they weren't quite sure what happened, and if we go back to Luke 24, what we realize is that it's the women who get it first, right?
Amen.
So, go women. If you listen closely, it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Mary, the mother of James, and a few others who were with them. They were the ones who saw the stone removed for the first time. They were the ones who were blessed with a vision of angels. And they were the ones who were told to remember what Jesus had told them. And they did, and they went back to the disciples. Now, did y'all catch what happened when they went back to the apostles? Yeah, they didn't believe them. It was an idle tale. An idle, oh man, I love that word. I wonder what the Greek was like. It was just an old women talking around. You can imagine, like they're just talking. No, this was not an idle tale. It was something that they believed. An empty tomb. But you know what? Even Peter, he ran all the way to that tomb, and those words did not even show up on his lips yet. He is risen was not spoken by Peter on that first Easter. We heard a little bit more of that story today. I wanted to tell a little bit more. I wanted to tell the story of the walk to Emmaus because it happened that same day. Luke is amazing as a gospel. He kind of compresses that whole resurrection thing of Jesus all at the last end of part of the gospel into one day, right? So he has Jesus, the angels appearing to the women going to talk to the disciples, a couple of them walking to Emmaus. Jesus appears to them, and then later on that day, there's witnessing. And the next day is when Jesus appears to the other disciples, and then he is ascended into heaven. It's kind of all quick at the end of that. Well, so on that same day, Jesus appeared as a traveler on the road to Emmaus, a town that's about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Now, can anybody tell me the last time you walked 7 miles? Now, I know you've walked 7 miles because you're a hiker. Anybody else? How long does it take to walk 7 miles?
A couple hours.
A couple hours. If you're going fast and it's a flat and level road, right? So I remember I lived in Espanola, New Mexico. I was a missionary, and where we lived was 7 miles away from a place called Chimayo. Now, if you ever get a chance to go to Chimayo, Chimayo is the lowrider capital of the United States. So you ever go to 7-Eleven and you see magazines that have Lowrider magazine? There are two places where they go to take pictures. It's in Chimayo, New Mexico, and Los Angeles. But anyway, that's another fun aside. But this place is 7 miles away from Espanola, and what Chimayo is really known for is that there is a Catholic church there that they claim that there have been miracles. And they have a pile of crutches as people go for the healing mud that comes out of the earth, and they put it on them and they walk away leaving their crutches behind. And so a tradition emerged in northern New Mexico where you would walk from Espanola to Chimayo on Good Friday. And so I did that one year. It was 7 miles, and it was a very long 7 miles. And it was up and down hills, and it was hot. And I had blisters on my feet the size of quarters at the end of the day. And so I'm thinking about this walk that these followers of Jesus are taking with Jesus, and they make it all the way to that place where they're going to stay the night. They go for dinner. Jesus is revealed to them in the breaking of the bread. And then what happens? They turn around and walk 7 miles back. I couldn't do that. I had a ride waiting for me when I got to Chimayo to bring me back home. We were told that they were not able to recognize Jesus until the breaking of the bread. And this failure to recognize Jesus after the resurrection is also found in the Gospel of John. We have that great story of Mary Magdalene thinking that Jesus is actually the gardener until Jesus calls her name out. And later on in the Gospel of John, we have Jesus appearing to the disciples who have all returned back to Galilee to start fishing again. That was their job before. And so you got Peter and 6 of the disciples who are in a boat in the morning, and Jesus appears to them, and they don't know who it is, and he says, "Why don't you start fishing from the other side?" Now, how many of you are fishers, and how many who fish, and how many would listen to somebody tell you, "Why don't you go fish someplace else?" Right? Now, you know your fishing spot. And so you can imagine these disciples probably rolling their eyes. All right, we're going to just throw our nets over the other side, and of course it overflows with fish. Now, next Sunday, we'll hear about doubting Thomas, but I think it's important for us to realize that even on Easter Sunday, there were people who did not recognize Jesus. Now, according to the Pew Research studies in the last few years, the level of belief in any religion is at an all-time low. And this generation under the age of 30 has had the lowest church attendance of any generation ever. And for many people heading off to college, there are more people without belief in God than those who do believe. And that's just kind of a reality of American studies. Now, there was a poll taken that was just released last week by Gallup that says that less than 50% of Americans are a member of a church. Now, it used to be 70% back in 2000. It used to be 83% back in 1970. And now there are 19% of people who say they are unaffiliated with any faith whatsoever. And that has risen from 8% back in 2000. And I've been trying to figure that out. I grew up in a faithful church. Like I told you, I get a text message every year. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. It's important for our family to share this story of faith. And some of it has to do with doubt. I mean, you all have friends who doubt this Christianity thing, right? Some of it has to do with politics. There was a study also in the same Pew Research poll that said, well, most people identify the church with one political party, and so they get turned off by it, and so they don't come to church anymore. Some of it has to do with demographics, as older people die and younger people are not raised in the church. And we've lost that sense of faith we share. Now, some will claim it's also the rise in our technological and scientific society. But the truth is that we have been in this sort of society for 300 years since the Enlightenment. We've already been wrestling with this idea of provable things and the scientific method. So I'm not quite sure that's the whole story either. We're 150 years removed from when Karl Marx wrote that religion is the opiate of the masses, or 130 years after the philosopher Nietzsche said that Christianity is a slave religion, something that Hitler took to heart. And when he rose as the head of Nazism, they really had a plan to end the church after they had eliminated the Jews. We are 70 years removed from a time when other philosophers wrote that God is dead. It was a movement that wanted to say that God has left us alone and we are all nothing. And how heartless was that? So education, philosophy, science, they're not the reason that Christianity is in decline. No, I think they're a symptom of other disease in our life, in our communities. And I think one thing that is a disease for most of us is hubris. Now, hubris is a fancy word to say pride. And I think what has happened, and the other thing I think is a part of our disease is distraction. And so I think what has happened in our world today is that we have made ourselves into God. And we forget that we are just human. We are distracted by politics. We argue over who are the greatest people among us. We are distracted by the constant availability of imaginary worlds on our phones and on our screens. I mean, how many of you thought that more people were excited about Game of Thrones than they were about Easter this week. I think Christianity is in decline because we do not recognize Jesus in our everyday living. And so I ask a lot of times in our church, where have you seen God this week, right? And I've asked that of you a couple of times. And you'd think that would be an easy question. But for most people, it's not. And most Sundays, now I got to tell you this, that when I asked that question at the 8 o'clock service, I had 8 people raise their hand this morning and say, I've seen God this week. And I'm glad, because it means that they are recognizing God in their everyday life. And I even shared my own story this morning, that where I saw God was in your daughter, Catherine, last week in church at 11 o'clock service. So we did all that reading last week out of the Bible. And at the point where we got to where the Bible says that Jesus was crucified on the cross, Deanna's daughter, Catherine, at 6 years old, finally understood what that meant. First time that she understood that Jesus died on the cross. And so what did she do? She started crying. So I made a 6-year-old cry in church last week, and that's where I saw God, right? But it wasn't just her. It was Deanna, and it was Ruth, and it was like 3 other people. And I'm like, what's the fuss? And I'm like, wait a minute, that's the whole point. That we need to be affected by this story of faith that affects us in a way that gives us empathy for others and for what has happened before. And so, where do we see God? Is it in the calling of our name? Is it in the breaking of the bread? Is it in a miraculous catch of fish on a Galilean seashore? Do we see God in the tears of a 6-year-old who has heard the story of Christ crucified for the first time? And I hope she comes to worship today, because I don't want her to be thinking that church is about crying. It's about the wonder of life. Do we see God in the artwork of Christian communities over the last 2,000 years that imagined Jesus in their own cultural context? Do you see God in the singing of hymns and songs that lift our souls up? Do we see God in the miracle of bees and flowers and gardens that are blooming? Do we see God in the last breath of a loved one as she dies? Or do we see God in the first cry of a baby being born? That's where I see God. And I think we've forgotten to proclaim and to believe that God's grace can reach us where we are, and that God's grace can save us no matter how distant we are from God. Because the fact of the matter is that even though we're in church, we are not God. We may be a little bit closer to God, but I think it's maybe the distance of maybe me standing on somebody else's shoulders. Right? And if God can reach us, then God can reach out to even those who don't have any belief at all. One thing I miss about being a campus minister is that on a daily basis I was surrounded by people, and I had all these encounters with people who were on the edge of faith. And what was, I'm not saying that you guys are on the edge of faith, but you kind of believe. You come to church, and so I have easy conversations with you about reading the Bible and things like that. But I would encounter people on a daily basis who were struggling with even understanding the concept of God. We had to have a long talk one day about the difference between Moses and Noah, because they didn't even know the story. Remember, Noah is the one that has 10 laws? No? All right, pop quiz? No. There were philosophy students that I had who would come and talk to me, and they would say they'd be so wrapped up in words and want to share with me all that they had learned from all these different philosophers. And they would, at the end of the conversation, they'd say, I wish I could believe in something. There were other students who were studying so hard in physics and chemistry, and they wanted rational proof for Jesus. And they wanted to talk about all the rational proof. And I'm like, yeah, you're not going to get that here. It's not a whole lot of it. And they couldn't find Jesus in their equations or in their symbols in their calculus books. There were people who were studying business, and I had this 20-year-old kid in my Wesley Foundation who had already made $500,000 in real estate by the time he was 20. He had one of those dads that kind of helped him out, first 10 properties, kind of thing. And that was what he was doing. He was studying business so he could be a successful business person. And he already had his retirement planned for the age of 30. And so we would talk about, well, what does life mean? Is there more to life than that? There were students who were studying psychology and sociology and who were so wrapped up in the how of the way people acted and lived in this world that they forgot to ask the why questions. Like, why are we here? I mean, think about it. The medical field, it's all about how can we solve this trauma? How can we solve these problems? But the question that we really need to ask is, why do we exist? And so as a Christian living in a world full of doubt, all I could do was plant seeds of hope that God would fertilize their hearts enough for that seed to bloom into a living faith. And frankly, that's how I often feel as a pastor sometimes in our community. As I go talk to people, I'm like, here's a seed of faith. Maybe after my 15th conversation with you, you'll come to church, or maybe you'll come to meet somebody else who can encourage you in your faith. And maybe that's all you can do in your world, right? You have people in your life that aren't Christian, right? You have family and friends who doubt things. You have people who make those comments about religion. So why is it that we come to church on Easter? Why do we come to celebrate a religion that's nearly 2,000 years old? Why do we support a belief system that many of our critics say is outdated or irrational or confusing? Why are we here? Well, maybe we're like Peter on that first Easter morning, heading back from the empty tomb, wondering to himself what happened. I can just imagine Peter just scratching his head saying, okay, the tomb is empty, and I'm not sure if someone stole his body or if Jesus is really alive. Or maybe we're like the women on that first Easter who are all about the business of this life. We're going to make sure that body doesn't stink. We're going to make sure it's taken care of. We're going to prepare it for burial. We're going to do what we can to get over our loss of this person we loved. Or maybe we're like the two followers of Jesus who are trying to deal with your sadness and to reflect on everything that Jesus says to us, but who are brought back to faith in the breaking of bread. Or maybe we're like the 7 disciples around the Sea of Galilee, going back to our lives before Jesus, fishing and making a living, who are again thrust into the bigger story as the Messiah returns and brings miracles to them again. I think we come to church because we have hope that the resurrection means something. We come to church this Easter because we want to have a purpose. We want to believe that there is something greater to life than just money or things or knowledge or prestige or power. We want to know that there is love that is greater than everything. A love that can transform. A love that can save us. And we come because we want to see God. And so, hallelujah, Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed. Hallelujah.
And amen. I don't have a song today because I lost my voice on Wednesday. If I start singing, it's going to sound like my dog barking. So, thank y'all for being here.